Hi, today I'm going to be reading to you from chapter 7 of the novel Alas Babylon. When nuclear fireballs crisped Orlando and the power plants serving Temecuen County, refrigeration stopped, along with electric cooking. The oil furnaces, sparked by electricity, died. All radios were useless unless battery powered or in automobiles. Washing machines, dryers, dishwashers, fryers, toasters, roasters, vacuum cleaners, shavers, heaters, beaters, all stopped. So did the electric clocks, vibrating chairs, electric blankets, and irons for pressing clothes and curling hair. The electric pumps stopped, and when the pumps stopped, the water stopped, and when the water stopped, the bathrooms ceased functioning. Not until the second day after the day did Randy Bragg fully understand and accept the results of the loss of electricity. Temporary loss of power was nothing new in Fort Repose. Often during the equinoctial storms, poles and trees came down, and often power lines were severed. And this condition rarely lasted for more than a day, for the repair trucks were out as soon as the wind abated and the roads became passable. It was hard to realize that this time the power plants themselves were gone. There could be no doubt of it. On Sunday and Sunday night, a number of survivors from Orlando's suburbs drove through Fort Repose, foraging for food and gasoline. They could not be positive of what had happened, except that the area of destruction extended for 8 miles from Orlando Airport, encompassing College Park and Rollins College, and another explosion had centered on McCoy Air Force Base. The Orlando Conelrad stations had warned of an air raid just before the explosions, so it was presumed that this attack had come from submarine-based missiles or ICBMs, but from bombers. Had not come, from submarine-based missiles or ICBMs, but from bombers. Randy did not hear Mrs. Van Brooker Brown again, or any further news or instructions on the Clear Channel stations on Sunday or Monday. He did hear WSMF announcing that it would only be on the air 2 minutes each hour thereafter, since it was operating on auxiliary power. He knew that the hospital in San Marco possessed an auxiliary diesel generator. He concluded that this source of power was being tapped each hour on the hour to operate the radio station. Each hour, the County Conelrad station repeated warnings. Boil all drinking water. Do not drink fresh milk. Do not use the telephone. And in the Sunday morning hours after the destruction of Orlando, warnings to take shelter and guard against fallout and radiation. There had been no milk deliveries, and the telephones hadn't worked since the first mushroom cloud sprouted in the south. Nor were there any actual shelters in Fort Repose. All Sunday, Randy insisted that Helen and the children stay in the house. He knew that any shelter, even a slate roof, insulation walls, and roof was better than none. There was no time to dig. The time to dig had been before the day. After Orlando, digging seemed like a wasted effort. Anyway, there were so many other things to do, each minor crisis demanding instant attention. While radiation was a danger, it could not be felt or seen, and therefore other dangers and even annoyances seemed more imperative. At 2 o'clock Monday afternoon, Helen was in Randy's apartment, and they were listening to the hourly Conelrad broadcast, when Ben Franklin marched in and announced, "We're just about out of water." "It's impossible," Randy said. "It's Peyton's fault," said Ben Franklin. "Every time she goes to the John, she has to flush it. The tub in our bathroom is empty, and she's been dipping water out of Mother's bathtub, too." Randy looked at Helen. This was a mother's problem. Peyton's a fastidious little girl, Helen said. After all, one of the first things a child learns is to always flush the john. What are we going to do? Fastidious, by the way, means like very clean and neat. Okay. Randy said, for now, Ben Franklin and I will drive down to the dock and fill up what wash tubs and buckets we have out of the river. You can't drink river water without boiling it, but it'll be okay for the toilets. And from now on, Peyton, all of us, can't afford to be so fastidious. We'll flush the toilets only twice a day, and then I guess we're going to have to dig latrines out in the grove because I can't haul water from the river forever. It's a matter of gasoline. Randy looked out on the grove, and noticing a thin powder of dust on the leaves. There had been a long dry spell. The fine, clear, crisp days with low humidity were wonderful for people, but bad for his orange crop. He would have to turn on the sprinklers in the grove. And then he slammed his fist on the bar counter and shouted, I'm a damn fool. We have all the water we want. Where? Helen asked. Right out there. Randy waved his arms. Artesian water is unlimited. But that's in the grove, isn't it? I'm sure that we can pipe in some into the house. After all, that's the same water that the Henrys use every day. I think that there's some big wrenches in the garage, and Malachi will know how to do it. Come on, Ben, let's go down to the Henrys. For those of you who are wondering what artesian water is, it's basically they have a well that's been drilled way down underneath the earth and into and below the limestone. So all of the water that you can access from the artesian well, although it may smell a little bit funny, it is potable, meaning you can drink it. Randy and the boy walked down the old gravel and clay road that led from the garage through the grove and to the river. Randy's navels had been picked clean, but the Valencia were still in the trees. They would not be picked this year. Matching strides with Randy, Ben Franklin said, I just thought of something. Yes? I don't have to go to school anymore. What makes you think you don't have to go to school? As soon as things get back to normal, you're going to go to school, young feller. Do you want to grow up to be an ignoramus? Ben scuffed a pebble and looked up sideways at Randy and grinned. What school? Why, the school in Fort Repose, of course, until you can go back to Omaha or wherever your father is stationed. Ben stopped. Just a minute, Randy. I'm not fooling myself. Nobody's going back to Omaha, maybe ever. And I don't think that I'll ever see Dad again. The hole wasn't safe. You know, maybe you think so, and I know Mother does. But I'm not fooling myself, Randy, and I don't want you to ever try to fool me. Randy put his hands on the boy's shoulders and looked into his face, measuring the depth of courage behind the brown eyes and finding it at least as deep as his own. Okay, son, he said, I'll level with you. And don't you ever do anything less with me. I think Mark has had it. I think that you're the man of the family from now on. That's what Dad said. Did he? Well, you're a man who still has to go to school, and I don't know where or when or how, but as soon as school reopens in Fort Repose or anywhere around you, you go. And you may have to walk. Golly, Randy, walk? It's 3 miles to town. Your grandfather used to walk to school in Fort Repose, so when he was your age, and there weren't any school buses, when he couldn't hitch a ride in or a buggy or one of those early automobiles, he walked. Randy put his arm around the boy's shoulders. Let's get going. I think that we'll both have to learn to walk again. Also, if you're trying to guesstimate how long it might take somebody to walk 3 miles into town, it would take about an hour, depending on the pace at which one is walking. A 3 mile per hour pace is, fairly steady. Might take you slightly longer if you were walking at a slower pace. They walked down the dock and then followed a trail that led through the dense hammock to the Henrys' cleared land. The Henrys' house was divided into 4 sections, representing 4 distinct points in their fortunes and history. The oldest section had originally been a 1-room log cabin. It was the only surviving structure of what had once been the slave quarters, and Randy recalled that his grandfather had always referred to the Henrys' place as the quarters. In recent years, the cabin had been jacked up and a concrete foundation laid under the stout cypress logs. The logs, originally chinked with red clay, were bound together with whitewashed mortar. It was now the Henrys' living room. Late in the 19th century, a 2-room pine shack had been added to the cabin. In the 20s, another room and a bath, more soundly constructed, had been tacked on. In the 40s, after Two-Tone's marriage to Missouri, the house had been enlarged by a bedroom and a new kitchen built with concrete block. It was a comfortable hodgepodge, its ugliness concealed under a patina of flame vine, bougainvillea, and hibiscus. A neat green bib of St. Augustine grass fell from the screened porch to the river and dock. In the backyard was a chicken coop and wired runs, a pig pen, and an ancient barn of unpainted cypress leaning wearily against a scabrous chinaberry tree. The barn housed Balaam, the mule, the Model A, and a bunch of white rabbits. 50 yards up the slope, Preacher Henry and Balaam solemnly disked the land, moving silently and evenly as if they perfectly understood each other. Caleb lay flat on his belly on the end of the dock, peering into the shadowed waters behind a piling, jigging a worm for brim. Two-Tone sat on the screened porch, rocking languidly and lifting a can of beer to his lips. From the kitchen came a woman's deep, rich voice singing a spiritual. That would be Missouri, washing the dishes. Hot black smoke from burning pine knots issued from both brick chimneys. It seemed a peaceful home in a time of peace. Ben Franklin yelled, "Hey, Caleb!" Caleb's face bobbed up. "Hi, Ben. Come on out." "What you catching?" "Ain't catching, just jigging." Randy said, "You can go out on the dock if you want, Ben, but I'll probably need your help in a little while." Ben looked surprised. "Me? You'll need my help?" "Yep," Randy said. "A man in the house has to do a man's work." Preacher Henry dropped his reins and yelled, "Ho!" and Balaam stopped. Preacher walked across the dusty field to be planted in corn in February to meet Randy. Malachi came out of the barn, and he had been under the Model A. Two-Tone stopped rocking and put down his can of beer and left the porch, and inside, Missouri stopped singing. Randy walked toward the back door, and the Henrys converged on him with their faces apprehensive. Malachi said, "Hello, Mr. Randy. Hope everything's all right." "About as right as they could be, considering. Is everything okay here?" "Just like always. How's the little girl? Missouri told me she was about blinded." "Peyton's better. She can see now, and in a few days she'll be allowed outside again, so there was no permanent injury." "The Lord be merciful," said Preacher Henry. "The Lord has spared us for the now, and I knew it was a-comin', for it was all set down, alas, Babylon." Preacher's eyes rolled upward. Preacher was big-framed, like Malachi, but now the muscles had shrunk around his bones, and the age and troubles deeply wrinkled and had darkened his face. Randy addressed his words to Preacher because Preacher was the father and the head of the household. "We don't have water in our house, and I wanted to take up some pipe out of the grove and hook it to the artesian system." "Yes, sir, Mr. Randy. I'll drop my diskin right now and help." No, no, you stick with the Diskin, preacher. I thought maybe Malachi and Two-Tone could help. By the way, when he says disking, it means that he and the mule are plowing the fields so that crops can be planted. Okay, it's manual labor, and it's what people would do if, for example, they don't have like a gasoline-powered tractor. Two-Tone, who was called Two-Tone because the right side of his face was 2 shades lighter than the left side, looked stricken. You mean now? Two-Tone said. Malachi grinned. You heard the man, Two-Tone. He means now. The 3 men, with Ben Franklin and Caleb helping, required 2 hours to lift the pipes and connect the artesian line with the water system in the pump house. It was the hardest work Randy remembered since climbing and digging in Korea. The palm of his right hand was blistered from the pipe wrench, and a swatch of skin flapped loose. He was exhausted and wet with sweat despite the chill of the evening, and he was grateful when Malachi offered to carry the tools back to the garage. And he said, "Thank you, Malachi. You know, that's $200 I loaned you?" "Yes, sir." "Just consider that debt canceled." They both grinned. Randy and Ben Franklin went back into the house. Randy turned on the tap in the kitchen sink. It gurgled, coughed, sputtered, and then spurted water. "Isn't it beautiful?" Helen said. Randy washed the grime from his hands, the water stinging the broken blisters. He filled a glass. The artesian water still smelled like rotten eggs. He gulped it. It tasted wonderful. Just after dawn on the 3rd day, a helicopter floated over Fort Repose and then turned toward the upper reaches of the Timucuan. Randy and Helen, hearing it, ran up to the captain's walk on the roof. It passed close overhead, and they distinguished the Air Force insignia. This is also the day of the disastrous overabundance. That morning, when Helen apprehensively opened the freezer, she found several 100 pounds of choice and carefully wrapped meat floating in a noxious sea of melted ice cream and liquefied butter. As any housewife would do under the circumstances, she wept. So, noxious means like gross, nauseating, disgusting. Combination, okay? Well, not combination, but it was a noxious sea of melted ice cream and liquefied butter. Because there had been no electricity, all of the stuff had begun to melt. And, so all of this meat, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat that Randy had thought, thinking that he was doing a good job in securing and procuring stuff for his household out on River Road, proved to be definitely a error in judgment, because he didn't think about the fact that there might not be power, that the refrigeration was going to be out permanently or for a long period of time. This disaster was perfectly predictable, Randy realized. He had been a fool. Instead of buying fresh meat, he should have bought canned meats by the case. If there was one thing he was certain he could have foreseen, was the loss of electricity. Even had Orlando escaped, the electricity would have died within a few weeks or months. Electricity was created by burning fuel oil in the Orlando plants, and when the oil ran out, it would not be replenished during the chaos of war. There was no longer a rail system or rail centers. It was Sam Hazard's guess that few major seaports had escaped after the first wave of missiles from the submarines that could still be taken out by atomic torpedoes, atomic mines or bombs or missiles from aircrafts. It was Sam Hazard's guess that what had been great ports were now great water-filled craters. Even those sections of the country which had escaped destruction entirely would not have lights on for long. Their power would only last as long as the fuel stocks on hand. Okay, so a few things that I want to point out on this chapter, okay? This is the chapter where you kind of see the residents and Randy's little enclave on Fort Repose having to start to adapt and make adjustments to the way that they're living their life. Why? Because they need this in terms of survival. Otherwise, and this goes back to Darwin's theory of the fittest and what Toynbee had said, that you have to be able to adapt if you're going to be able to survive. Okay, and they do want to survive, and so they are going to have to start making adaptations. It's around this point that I also kind of asked my students to take a look at the items that they had thought that they were going to bring with them if they needed to be able to survive. And that's when people start to realize that, a lot of stuff that they chose to put on their list was dependent upon electricity. Okay. They stared into the freezer, Helen sniffling, Randy numb, Ben Franklin fascinated. Ben dipped his finger into a pool of liquid chocolate and licked it. Still tastes good, but it isn't even cool, he said. Oh, that ice cream. I could have been eating ice cream all yesterday. Peyton, too. Helen stopped sniffling. The meat won't spoil for another 24 hours, and I'm going to salvage what I can. How? Randy asked. Boil it, salt it, preserve it, pickle it. I've got a dozen mason jars in the closet, and there may be more around somewhere. Perhaps you can get some in downtown, Randy. Town and back means a half a gallon of gas, Randy said. Well, it's worth it if you can find just a few, and we'll need more salt. Okay, I'll give it a try. Maybe I can find jars at the hardware store. Becca's still keeping it open. Helen reached into the freezer and lifted out 2 steaks, 6-pounders, 2 inches thick. She brought out 2 more steaks, even thicker. Steaks, 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 everywhere steaks. How many steaks can Graff eat tonight? How does Graff like his steaks? Charbroiled? Graff, lying in the doorway between kitchen and utility room, ears cocked and alert at the sound of his name, sniffed the wonderful odor of ripening meat in quantity. He likes them and I like them, Randy said. And we'll get a few sacks of charcoal in the garage. I've got a few sacks of charcoal in the garage. So, let's have a party. A steak party to end all steak parties. Literally, that is. We'll have the Henrys and the McGoverns. I've always believed in mixing crowds at my parties, Helen said. But what about mixing colors? It'll be all right. I'll ask Florence Weecheck and Alice Cooksey and Sam Hazard too, and Dan Gunn if I can find him. And I'll scrounge around for more charcoal. It'll be a relief from cooking in the fireplace. So when Helen is asking him about mixing colors, again, I have to remind you of the time period in which this book is set, and she's talking about mixing races. She is legitimately saying, will everybody be all right with having people of color, having black people at this barbecue? Okay, and Randy says, yes, by all means, that is what we are going to do. And definitely from the beginning of the book and the way people act in Fort Repose, they may be in the minority in feeling this way. Okay, but as you will see in the future, and the book will mention it again, but for example, a string of fish catched by a white man or a black man is still a string of fish when you're hungry. Don't forget the salt, Helen said. We're going to need a lot to save this meat. On this, the 3rd day, after the day, the character of Fort Repose had changed. Every building still stood. No brick had been displaced, yet all was altered, especially the people. Earlier, Randy had noticed that some of the plate glass store windows had cracked under the shock waves from Tampa and Orlando. And now the windows of a number of stores were shattered entirely, and glass littered the sidewalks. From the alleyways came the sour smell of uncollected garbage. Most of the parking spaces on Yulee and St. John's incongruously were occupied, but the cars themselves were empty, and several had been stripped of wheels. There was no commerce. There were few people. Altogether, Randy saw only 4 or 5 cars in motion, and those who were not out of gas hoarded what remained in their tanks against graver emergencies to come. The pedestrians he saw seemed apprehensive, hurrying along on missions private and vital, shoulders hunched, eyes directed dead ahead. There were no women on the streets, and the men did not walk in pairs, but alone and warily. Randy saw several acquaintances who must have recognized his car, but no one smiled or waved. 4 young men, strangers, idled in front of the drugstore. The store's windows were broken, but Randy saw the grim, unhappy face of old man Hochstetler, the druggist, at the door. He was staring at the young men, and they were elaborately ignoring him. They were waiting for something, Randy felt. They were waiting like vultures. They were outwaiting old man Hochstetler. Randy pulled into the parking lot alongside Ajax Supermarket. It appeared to be empty. The front door was closed and locked, but Randy stepped through a smashed window. The interior looked as if it had been stripped and looted. All that remained of the stock, he noticed immediately, were fixtures, dishes, and plastics on the home hardware shelves. Significantly, nobody had bothered to buy or take electric cords, fuses, or light bulbs. As for food, there seemed to be none left. Randy tried to remember where the salt counter had been, but salt was something one bought without thought, like razor blades or toothpaste, not bothering about it until it was needed. And he thought of razor blades. He was low on them. Finally, he examined the guidance signs hanging over the empty shelves, and he saw salt, flour, grits, sugar over a wall to his left. The space where these commodities should have been was bare. Not a single bag of salt remained. As Randy turned to leave, he heard a noise, wood scraping on concrete in the stockroom in the rear of the store, and he opened the stockroom door and found himself looking into the muzzle of a small, shiny revolver. Behind the gun was the skinny, olive-colored face of Pete Hernandez. Pete lowered the gun and jammed it into a hip pocket. "Geez, Randy," he said. "I thought it was some goddamn goon come back to clean out the rest of the joint. All I wanted was some salt." "Salt? You out of salt already?" "No, we want to salt down some meat. We thought we could save part of the meat in the freezer." Randy saw a grocery truck drawn up to the loading platform behind the store. It was half filled with cases, and Pete had been pushing other cases down the ramp. So Pete had saved something. "What happened here?" Randy asked. "Well, we'd sold out of just about everything by closing time yesterday. And when I tried to close up, they wouldn't leave. They wouldn't pay neither. They started hollering and laughing and grabbing, and I locked myself in back here, and that's how's come I've got a little something left." Pete winked. "But I bet I can get some price for those canned beans in a couple of weeks." Randy sensed that Pete, perhaps because he had never had much money, still coveted money. He said, "I'll give you a price for salt right now." So again, while Randy and a lot of other people have realized that money is essentially worthless, okay, Pete Hernandez, the owner of the Ajax Supermarket, is still focused on money, okay, and Randy is going to exploit this right now so that he can get salt, so that they can salt the meat. Pete's eyes flicked sideways. There was a cart in the corner. It was filled with white sacks, sugar, and salt. Pete said, "I've hardly got enough salt to keep things going at home. We're in the same boat you are, freezer full of meat. Maybe Rita will be salting meat down too." Randy brought out his wallet. Pete looked at it. Pete looked greedy. Randy said, "What'll you take for 2 10-pound sacks of salt?" "I ain't got much salt left." "I'll give you $10 a pound for salt." That's $200. Being it's you, okay. Randy gave him 450s. Pete felt the bills. $10 a pound for salt. He said, ain't that something? Randy cradled the sacks under each arm. Better go out the back way, Pete said. Don't tell nobody where you got it. And Randy? Yes? Rita wonders when you're coming to see her. She's all the time talking about you. When Rita latches on to a guy, she doesn't let go in a hurry. You know Rita. Randy rejected the easy evasion of his excuses. One of the things that he hadn't liked about Rita was her possessiveness, and another thing was her brother. He was irritated because he had placed himself in the position of being forced to discuss personal matters with Pete, and he said, Rita and I are through. And we're back. That's not what Rita says. Rita says that other girl, that Yankee blonde, won't look so good to you now. Rita says this war is going to level people as well as cities. Randy knew it was purposeless to talk about Rita or anything with Pete Hernandez, and he said, so long, Pete, and left the market. Beck's Hardware was still open, and Mr. Beck looked tired and bewildered. He presided over rows of empty shelves. On the day itself, everything that could be immediately useful, from flashlights and batteries to candle and kerosene lanterns, had vanished. In the continuing buying panic, almost everything else had disappeared. The only reason I'm still here, Mr. Beck explained, is because I've been coming here every weekday for 22 years and I don't know what else to do. In the warehouse, Beck found a dusty carton of mason jars. People don't go in much for home canning nowadays, Beck said, and I'd just forgotten about these. How much? Randy asked. Beck shook his head. Nothing. That safe is full up to the top with money. That's all I've got left. Money. And ain't that funny? Nothing but money. Mr. Beck laughed. Know what? I could retire. Randy drove on to the Medical Arts Building. Here he had expected to find activity, but he found none. He did see Dan Gunn's car in the parking lot, and there were reddish-brown stains on the sidewalk and the green concrete steps. The glass in the front door was shattered, and the door itself swung open. The waiting room was ominously empty. There was no one at the reception desk. Randy possessed a country dweller's keen sense of smell, and now he smelled many alarming odors: disinfectant, ether, spilled drugs, spilled blood, stale urine. He called, Dan! Hey, Dan! I'm back here. Who's that? Dan's voice emerged, muffled, after echoing through a corridor. It's me, Randy. Come on back. I'm in my office. In the corridor's gloom, Randy stumbled over a pair of feet, and he stepped back, shivering, and a body lay athwart the doorway of the exam room, legs in the corridor, torso in the room, face up, arms outstretched. That face was half blown away, but when put together with the uniform, it was recognizable as Cappy Fouracre, Fort Repose's chief of police. Randy hurried on. A fireproof door hung crazily from one hinge. It had been axed open. Behind the door was the laboratory and drug storage, and the smell of chemicals that came from the laboratory was choking and overpowering. Within, Randy glimpsed a hillock of smashed jars and bottles. The clinic had been wrecked, insanely and deliberately. He was relieved to find Dan Gunn standing in his office. Dan's face was more deeply shadowed, and fatigue, and a 2-day growth of beard. His shirt was torn, and he looked dirty, but he apparently was unhurt. 2 medical bags were open on his desk, and he was examining and sorting vials and bottles. Randy said, What happened? A carload of addicts Hopheads came through last night, about 3 this morning, rather. Jim Bloomfield was here sleeping on the couch in his office. We'd split up the duty. He took one night and I took the next. You see, with no phones, people don't know what else to do except rush to the clinic if there's an emergency. Anyways, the addicts, there were 6 of them, all armed, came in and woke Jim up. They wanted a fix. Poor old Jim was something of a Puritan, and if he had given them a fix, he might have gotten rid of them. Dan picked up a hypodermic syringe and slowly squeezed the plunger with his tremendous fingers. I'd have given him a fix all right. 3 grains of morphine, and that would have finished them. Dan dropped the syringe into one of the bags and shook his head. That probably wouldn't have been smart either. 3 grains would kill a normal man, but it wouldn't even faze an addict. Anyway, Jim told them to go to hell. They beat him up. They emptied these bags and found what they were after. That wasn't enough, and then they took the fire axe and broke into the lab and drug storage, and they cleaned us out of narcotics. Everything. Not only morphine, but all the barbiturates and sodium amytal and pentothal and stimulants like Benzedrine and Dexedrine. What they didn't take, they smashed. What about Cappy Fouracre? Randy asked. Some woman came in and heard the commotion and ran out and got Cappy. He was sleeping in the firehouse. Cappy and Bert Andrews, you know, that kid assistant, came screaming over here, literally screaming with their siren going, the darn fools, so the hopheads were set for them. There was a battle, more like a firefight, an ambush, I guess, and Cappy caught a shotgun load in the face. Anders got one in the belly. Cappy was dead when I got here, about 15 minutes later. And old Doc Bloomfield? Randy asked. Dan swayed and rested his palms on the desk. His head bent. When he spoke, it was in a monotone. I drove Anders and Jim Bloomfield to the hospital in San Marco. I couldn't operate here, you see. No anesthesia. Couldn't even sterilize my instruments. Everything septic. Young Anders was dead when I got there. Jim was still alive, and I thought he was going to be all right. Beaten up. Maybe a rib or 2 caved in. Maybe concussion. Still, he was able to tell me quite coherently what had happened. And then he just slipped away from me. I don't know why. He had lived a long time, and after this thing happened, maybe he didn't want to live any longer. Maybe he didn't want to belong to the human race anymore. He resigned. He died. Randy said, "The bastards. Where did they come from and where did they go?" Dan Gunn shivered. The night had been chilly, and it had warmed only slightly during the day, and of course there was no heat in the building. He shook his head and slowly straightened, like a great storm-beset ship that had been wallowing in the trough of the sea, but will not founder. Where did they come from? He said, slipping on his coat. Maybe they broke out of a state hospital, but more likely they were hoods from St. Louis or Chicago, driving to Miami or Tampa for the season. Probably they were addicts as well as pushers, and the war caught them between sources of supply. So by last night they were wild for junk. And the quickest way to get it was to detour to some little town like this and raid the clinic. As to where they're going, I don't care, so long as it's far from here. Randy resolved never again to leave the house unless he was armed. You should carry a gun, Dan. I am from now on. Dan said, Nope, I'm not going to carry a gun. I've spent too many years learning how to save lives to start shooting people now. And I'm not worried about punishment for the addicts. They carry a built-in torture chamber. Eventually, I'd say within a few weeks, no matter how many people they kill, they'll find no drugs. After this big jag, they're bound to have withdrawal sickness, and they will die. Horribly, I hope. Dan closed the 2 bags. So ends the clinic in Fort Repose. Can you give me a lift to the hotel, Randy? I think my gas tank is dry. I'll take you to your hotel only so you can pack, Randy said. On River Road, we've got food and good water and wood fireplaces. At the hotel, you don't have any of those things. He picked up one of the bags. Now don't argue with me, Dan. Don't start talking about your duty. Without food and heat, you can't do anything. You can't even sterilize a scalpel. You won't have enough strength to take care of anybody, and you can't even take care of yourself. So, this next part is a definite illustration or example of people who are not adapting or are refusing to adapt to the changes that have been set forth by the nuclear bombs. And you're going to see what's going on at the Riverside Inn. Earlier, when I mispronounced hotel at the beginning, I almost called it a helltel, and that's pretty much what it is right now. When they entered the hotel, Randy smelled it at once, but not until they reached the second floor did he positively identify the odor. Like songs, odors are catalysts of memory. Smelling the odors of the Riverside Inn, Randy recalled the sickly, pungent stench of the honey carts with their loads of human manure for the fields of Korea. Randy spoke of this to Dan, and Dan said, "I've tried to make them dig latrines in the garden, and they won't do it. They have deluded themselves into believing that lights, water, maids, telephone, dining room service, and transportation will all come back in a day or two. Most of them have little hoards of canned foods, cookies, and candies, and they eat in their rooms alone. Every morning they wake up saying that things will be back to normal by nightfall, and every night they fall into bed thinking that normalcy will be restored by morning. It's been too big a jolt for these poor people, and they can't face reality." Dan had been talking as he packed. As they left the hotel, laden with bags and books, Randy said, "What's going to happen to them?" "I don't know. There's bound to be a great deal of sickness, and I can't prevent it because they won't pay attention to me. And I can't stop an epidemic if it comes. I don't know what's going to happen to them." Dan moved into the house on River Road that day. Thereafter, he slept in the sleigh bed, the only bed in the house that could comfortably accommodate his frame, in Randy's apartment, while Randy occupied the couch in the living room. The night afterwards was remembered as the night of the great steak orgy. Yet it was not for the rich taste of meat well hung that Randy remembered the night. He and Admiral and Bill McGovern cooked the steaks outside, and they brought them into the living room. Fat wood burned in the big fireplace, and a kettle steamed on hot bricks. At a few minutes before 10, Randy clicked on his transistor radio, and they all listened. Lib McGovern was sitting on the rug next to him, her shoulder touching his arm. The room was warm and comfortable and somehow safe. They heard the hum of a carrier wave, and then the voice of an announcer from the Clear Channel station, somewhere deep in the heart of the country. "This is your Civil Defense Headquarters. I have an important announcement. Listen carefully. It will not be repeated again tonight. It will be repeated, circumstances permitting, at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." Randy felt Lib's long fingers circle his forearm and grasp tight. Around the group before the fire, all the faces were anxious. The white faces in the front row, the Negro faces, eyes white and large behind. "A preliminary aerial survey of the country has been completed. By order of the acting chief executive, Mrs. Van Brugge Brown, certain areas have been declared contaminated zones. It is forbidden for people to enter those zones. It is forbidden to bring any material of any kind, particularly metal or metal containers, out of these zones. Persons leaving the contaminated zones must first be examined at checkpoints now being established. The location of these checkpoints will be announced over your local Conelrad stations. The contaminated zones are The New England states. Sam Hazard, sitting in a prim cherry-wood rocker, which, like Sam, had originated in New England, drew in his breath. The newscaster continued. All of New York State, south of the line, Ticonderoga, Sackett's Harbor. The state of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. The District of Columbia. Ohio, east of the Sandusky-Chillicothe line. Also in Ohio, the city of Columbus and its suburbs. In Michigan, Detroit and Dearborn and an area of 50-mile radius from these cities. Also in Michigan, the cities of Flint and Grand Rapids. In Virginia, the entire Potomac River Basin, the cities of Richmond and Norfolk and their suburbs. In South Carolina, the port of Charleston and all territories within a 30-mile radius of Charleston. In Georgia, the cities of Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, and their suburbs. The state of Florida. Now, Randy felt angry and insulted. He shifted his weight and started to get to his feet. Not the whole state, he said. And at the same time, revealing his protest was completely irrational. Shh, Lib said, and pulled him back to the rug. The voice went on, ticking off Mobile, Birmingham, New Orleans, and Lake Charles. It moved into Texas, obliterating Fort Worth and Dallas and everything within a 50-mile radius of those two cities, and Abilene, Houston, and Corpus Christi. It moved northward again. In Arkansas, Little Rock and its suburbs, plus an area of 40 miles to the west of Little Rock. Missouri, who throughout the whole evening had said nothing except in answer to questions, now said something. How come they hit Little Rock? Their admiral said, there's a big SAC base in Little Rock, or was. The voice continued up to Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and then spoke of Chicago and everything around Chicago in northern Indiana, and crept up the western shore of Lake Michigan till Milwaukee and Milwaukee's suburbs. Inexorably, it uttered the names of Kansas City, Wichita, and Topeka, and the voice continued, in Nebraska, Lincoln, also in Nebraska, Omaha, and all the territory within a 50-mile radius of Omaha. There goes all hope of Mark, Randy thought. More than one missile for Omaha, probably 3, as Mark had expected, and from the moment of the double dawn on the day, he had known it was probable. Now he must accept it as almost certain. He looked across the circle at 3 faces in the firelight. Peyton's face was half hidden against her mother's breast, and Helen's face bent down, and her arms were around Peyton's shoulders. And Ben Franklin stared into the fire, his chin straight, and Randy could see the tear path down Helen's face and the unshed tears in Ben's eyes. The announcement went on, the voice calling out portions of states and cities. Seattle, Hanford, San Francisco, all of the southern California coast, Helena, Cheyenne, but Randy only half heard them. All he could hear distinctly were the sharp sobs out of Peyton's throat. Randy's heart went out to them, but he said nothing. What was there to say? How do you say to a little girl that you're sorry that she no longer has a father? Close to his side, Lib stirred and spoke only 2 words to Helen. I'm sorry. Randy had noticed that evening a tenseness between Helen and Lib, and nothing was said, and there was a watchfulness and a hostility between them, so he was glad that Lib had spoken. He wanted them to like each other, and he was puzzled that they didn't. Then it was over. The radio stilled. More than ever, Randy felt cut off and isolated. Florida was a prohibited zone, and Fort Repose a tiny, isolated sector within that zone. He could appreciate why the whole state had been designated a contaminated area. There were so many bases, so many targets which had been hit with resulting contamination. They had been extraordinarily fortunate in Fort Repose. The wind had favored them, and they had received only a residue of fallout from Tampa and Orlando, and none at all from Miami and Jacksonville. Even a reasonably clean weapon on Patrick would have rained radioactive particles on Fort Repose, but the enemy had not bothered to hit Patrick. Standing on the other side of the room, Preacher Henry had been listening, but he did not fully understand the designation of contaminated zones or comprehend the implications. He did feel and understand the shock and grief the broadcast brought to the Braggs, and he sensed it was time for him to leave. He nudged Malachi and touched Two-Tone's rump with his toe, caught the attention of Hannah and Missouri, and said with dignity, "We be going now. I thank you, Mr. Randy, for a real fine steak dinner, and I hope that we can repay it." Randy rose to his feet and said, "Good night, Preacher. It was good to have you all." On the fourth day after the day, Malachi and Two-Tone extended the artesian water system to the houses of Admiral Hazard and Florence Weechek. Stretching a pipe across the grove to the Admiral's house was simple, but to provide water for Florence Weechek and Alice Cooksey, it was necessary to dig through the macadam of River Road with picks. On the night of the sixth day, the Riverside Inn burned. With no water in the hydrants and the hotel sprinkler system inoperable, the fire department was all but helpless. Only a few reserve firemen showed up, and only one pumper was gotten into action using river water. It was a puny effort and far too late. The old resinous wood structure was burning brightly before the first stream touched the walls. Soon the heat drove the firemen away, and a few minutes thereafter the last scream was heard from the third floor. Dan had been summoned an hour later, and Randy had driven him to town. By then there was nothing to do except care for the survivors, and there were few. Some of them died of smoke, poisoning, or fear. It was hard to diagnose within a few hours. The burned were taken to San Marco in Bubba Offenhouse's hearse ambulance. The uninjured were lodged in the Fort Repose school, and there was no heat in the school or food or water. It was simply shelter and vastly less comfortable than the hotel, and within a few days, more squalid. Dan Gunn suspected that the fire had started in a room where the guests were using canned heat in an attempt to boil water, or perhaps that someone had built a makeshift wood stove. It was, Dan said, inevitable. Canned heat are those like little Sterno cans. They're like these little circular cans that you maybe sometimes see at buffets. It's almost like they have like petroleum in them, or like a jelly, and you use a lighter and you light it, and then the heat keeps whatever hot food you have sitting in those like chafing dishes or in the like buffet dishes. It keeps everything warm. That's what canned heat is. On the 9th day after the day Lavinia McGovern died, this too had been inevitable ever since the lights went out and refrigeration ceased. Since Lavinia McGovern suffered from diabetes, insulin had kept her alive, and without refrigeration, insulin deteriorated rapidly. Not only Lavinia, but all diabetics in Fort Repose dependent upon insulin died at about the same period as the drug lost its potency. Randy and Dan had done their best to save her. They had driven to San Marco, hoping to find refrigerated insulin or the new oral drug at the hospital. It was 18 miles to San Marco, and even driving at the most economical speed in his heavily horse-powered car, Randy estimated that the trip would consume 3 gallons of gas. He estimated he had only 5 gallons remaining in his tank, plus a 5-gallon can in reserve. Randy made a difficult decision. By then, the Bragg home was linked to the houses of Admiral Hazard, Florence Weecheck, and the Henrys, not only by the arterial system of pipes fed by nature's pressure, but by other common needs. The Henrys' Model A was neither beautiful nor comfortable, but its engine was twice as thrifty as Randy's rakish sports hardtop. Sam Hazard's car gulped gasoline as fast as Randy's. Dan's was empty, and the Model A was even more economical than Florence's old Chevy. Randy decided that henceforth the Model A would furnish community transportation. So, it was in the Model A that Randy and Dan made the trip to San Marco. You're going to see, for example, that things that are kind of like old or antiquated are definitely going to be serving a purpose in this book or in this story. We're seeing, Randy had a brand new car, the latest model, a little sports car. But guess what? It's not fuel efficient. And so what is the car that ends up becoming the community car? The Model A, which is like super old, and it is not flashy, it's not expensive, but it is the one that is the most economical on gas. You're also going to see, as we continue in the book, but you'll see it a little bit later in this chapter, that even though the book kind of starts off painting the Henrys being poor, okay, and more like economically depressed, now the Henrys are rich. I'm not talking about rich in terms of money, but they are rich in terms of like their resources. And you will see that a lot of the Henrys' resources end up helping provide for their little community out on River Road. And had they not, for example, been farmers and grown some of their own crops because they needed it to eat, or had pigs, and chickens, you would see that they would not be able to have anything or much of anything to eat. So there you go. The trip was a failure. The hospital no longer possessed insulin or substitutes for insulin. Like the pharmacy, the hospital had purchased its supplies in small quantities and was dependent on weekly or bi-weekly deliveries from jobbers in the large cities. Its insulin had already gone to meet the demand in its own community. Furthermore, the hospital's auxiliary generator was operated only during the evening hours for emergency operations and for a few minutes each hour on the hour to supply power for WSMF. It was necessary to conserve fuel, and unless the generator ran continuously, it was inadequate for refrigeration. We should definitely know all about refrigeration. If you have gone through a hurricane, like I have, live in Miami, if you've gone through a hurricane and you have a generator, one of the things that you do is you run the generator so that you can keep your refrigerator going and you can keep your food cold and you can keep stuff from spoiling. Let's see. Bouncing back to Fort Repose in the Model A, Dan grumbled. The place we should have built up stockpiles was out in the country like Timucuan County. Stockpiles weren't going to be of much use in the cities because after the day, there weren't going to be any cities left. But where were the stockpiles? In the cities, of course, because it was easier. And when Dan is talking about stockpiles, they're just talking about like all sorts of like extra supplies that one would need in terms or in case of a disaster. And he's saying that the logical place for it to be stockpiles to be kept is outside of like these big cities, because if the big cities are the targets, they're going to get destroyed, and thus all the stockpiles would get destroyed too, or there would be no way for people to get the stockpiles out of the cities. So if you kept the stockpiles out in like a suburban area or out in like a rural area, like what he's referring to in Timucuan County, then stockpiles would be available. But that is definitely not what has happened. So, Lavinia McGovern, after 48 hours in coma, died. Alice Cooksey was at her bedside after midnight on the 9th day when Lavinia died. Lavinia's husband and daughter, both exhausted from the efforts to keep the house in some sort of order, slept, and Alice did not wake them, or anybody, until morning. She kept vigil alone, dozing on a chaise. Nothing could help Lavinia, but everybody needed sleep. Alice brought the news to the Bragg house in the morning. A fire blazed in the dining room, which smelled pleasantly of bacon and coffee. Randy, Helen, the children, and Dan Gunn were at breakfast. A breakfast exactly like the one that they would have eaten 10 days before, with one important exception. There was fresh orange juice, freshly squeezed, fresh eggs from the Henry's yard, bacon, and coffee. There was no toast because there was no bread. Randy already was beginning to miss bread, and he wondered why he had not thought to buy flour. By the time that Helen had put flour on the list, the shelves were bare of it. He suspected that the older housewives of Fort Repose, remembering a time when people baked their own bread instead of buying it packaged, sliced with vitamins re-injected, had cleaned the stores out of flour on the day. He resolved that when he could, to trade for flour, because it would be June before they could look forward to cornbread from Preacher Henry's crop. I would also like to point out, given that we are experiencing a pandemic at this point in time, you probably have seen on the news that especially during like March, April, May, June, July even, that flour, yeast, all sorts of stuff was very hard to come by. I mean, we've heard all the stories about, there not being toilet paper and there not being maybe paper towels or Lysol or Clorox wipes. But we were also running short on certain food stocks, and flour and yeast were one of them. Why? Well, people had a lot of time at home, and they were able to bake their own bread. And so if you have nothing but time, bread is a good way to fill that void. I myself have baked bread during the pandemic. I actually became really good at baking like rustic crusty bread that looked like something that you would get at the macaroni grill. Okay, so this is definitely something that if you're reading this book, that you should be able to understand, because we have experienced shortages. Alice had bicycled from the McGovern house. Before she closed the Western Union office, Florence had salvaged the messenger's bicycle. It was a valuable possession, and now all their remaining gasoline was pooled to operate one car, and the bicycle was primary transportation for Alice and Florence. Alice was, for the first time in her life, dressed in slacks, a necessity for bicycling. She accepted coffee and told of Lavinia's death. Bill McGovern and Elizabeth, she said, were taking it well, but they didn't know what to do with the body, and they were going to need help with the burial. Before we go back to Lavinia, I also would like to point out that bicycling, right? During this pandemic, people have been trying to exercise. For example, bicycling. I've never seen more people outside just walking, and it's legit because when we were on lockdown, we started on lockdown on March 13th. People were going stir crazy. You just need or want to get out of the house. Fortunately, living in suburbia in Miami, people were able to get out, walk, ride bicycles. Lots of bicycles. Bicycle sales went through the roof. Also, home exercise equipment. The sale of that stuff went through the roof, and it's because people are stir crazy. You needed something to do, and I mean, you can only sit around and watch Netflix for however many hours each day. I'll go to see Bubba Offenhouse right away, Dan said, and try to arrange for burial. I've got to talk to Bubba anyway, and I can't seem to impress upon him the importance of burying the dead as quickly as possible. He suddenly seems to hate his profession. That's not like Bubba, Alice Cooksey said. Bubba always bragged that he was the most efficient undertaker in Florida. He used to say, when the retired started coming to Fort Repose, they found a mortuary with all of the modern conveniences. That's the trouble, Dan said. Bubba abhors unorthodox funerals. Abhors means hates, by the way, or dislikes. He almost wept when I insisted that the poor devils who died in the fire be buried at once in a single grave, and we had to use a bulldozer, you know. Bubba claims that Repose in Peace Park is now ruined for good. Randy had been silent since Alice brought the news, and now he spoke as if he had been holding a silent debate with himself and had finally reached a conclusion. They'll have to live here. Helen set down her coffee cup. Who'll have to live here? We'll have to ask Lib and Bill McGovern to stay with us. But we don't have room, and how will we feed them? Randy was puzzled and disturbed. He had never thought of Helen as a selfish woman, and yet obviously she didn't want the McGoverns. We have plenty of room, he said. There's still an empty bedroom upstairs, and Bill can have it, and Lib can sleep with you. With me? He could see that Helen was angry. Well, you have twin beds in your room, Helen. But if you seriously object, Bill can sleep in my apartment. There's an extra couch, and Lib can have the room. After all, it's your home, Helen said. As a matter of fact, Helen, the house is half Mark's, which makes it half yours. So, the decision is yours as well as mine. Lib and Bill have no water and no heat and not much food left because almost all their food reserve was in their freezer. They don't even have a fireplace. They have been cooking and boiling water on a charcoal grill in their Florida room. Helen shrugged and said, Well, I guess you'll have to ask them. Elizabeth can sleep with me, but I hope it isn't a permanent arrangement. After all, our food supply is limited. It is limited, Randy said, and it's only going to get worse whether the McGoverns are here or not. We're all going to have to scrounge for food pretty quick. Dan rose and said, I better get going. Randy followed him. He had cultivated the habit of leaving his .45 automatic on the hall table and pocketing it as he left the house, as a man would put on a hat. Since he never wore a hat and never before had carried a gun, except in the army, he still had to make a conscious effort to remember. When they were in the car, Randy said, That was a strange way for Helen to behave. Don't know what's eating her. Not at all strange, Dan said. Just human. She's jealous. That's ridiculous. No. Helen is a fiercely protective woman, protective of her children. With Mark gone, you and the house are her security, and the children's security. She doesn't want to share you and your protection. It's a matter of self-preservation, not infatuation. I see, Randy said, or at least I think I see. They drove up to the McGovern house. Randy said, It's pointless for both of us to go in. Nothing you can do here. While you get Bubba off in house, I'll tell them that they're going to move and get them going. Right, Dan said. Economy of effort and forces. Always a good rule of war. Randy walked to the house, wondering a bit about himself. Without being conscious of it, he had begun to give orders in the last few days. Even to the Admiral he had given orders, and he had assumed leadership in the tiny community bound together by the water pipes leading from the artesian well. Since no one had seemed to resent it, he guessed it had been the proper thing to do. It was it wasn't the same, but it was something like commanding a platoon. When you had the responsibility, you also had the right to command. The McGovern house was damp and it was chilly. It retained the cold of night. Lib, wearing corduroy jodhpurs and a heavy blue turtleneck sweater, greeted him at the door. She said, I heard the jalopy and I knew it was you. Thanks for coming, Randy. She held out her hands to him and he kissed her. Her hands felt cold, and when he looked down at them, he saw that her fingernails, always so carefully kept, were broken and crusted with dirt. Still, she was dry-eyed and calm. Whatever tears she had had for her mother were already shed, Randy said. Alice told us we're all terribly sorry, darling. He knew it sounded insincere, and it was. With so many dead, so many friends for whom he had not yet had time even for thought, the death of one woman whom he did not admire overmuch, and with whom he had never been close, and could not be close, was a triviality. With perhaps half the country's population death itself, unless it took someone close and dear, was trivial. She said, "Come on in and talk to Dad. He's worried about how we're going to bury her." "We're arranging that," Randy said, and followed her into the house. Bill McGovern sat in the living room, staring out at the river. He had not bothered to dress or shave. Over his pajama and robe, he had pulled on a top coat. Randy turned to Lib. "Have either of you had breakfast?" She shook her head no, and Bill spoke without turning his head. "Hello, Randy. I'm not much of a success, am I, in a time of crisis? I can't feed my daughter or myself or even bury my wife, and I wish I had enough guts to swim out into the channel and sink. That can't help Lavinia and wouldn't help Elizabeth or anybody. You and Lib are going to come live with me, and things will be better." "Randy, I'm not going to impose myself on you. I might as well face it. I'm finished. You know, I'm over 60. And do you know what the worst thing is? Central Tool and Plate. I spent my whole life building it up. What is it now? Chances are just a mess of twisted and burned metal. Junk. So, there goes my life, and what good am I? I can't start over. Central Tool and Plate is junk, and I'm junk." Randy stepped over and stood between Bill and the cracked window so as to look him in the face. "You might as well stop feeling sorry for yourself," he said. "You're going to have to start over. Either that or die, and you have to face it." Lib touched her father's shoulder. "Come on, Dad." Bill didn't move or reply. Randy felt anger inside him. "You want to know what good you're at? That means what good you are to somebody else, not to yourself, doesn't it? If you're no good to anybody else, I guess you better take that long swim. You know something else about machinery, don't you?" McGovern pushed himself in his chair. "I know as much about machine tools as any man in America." "I didn't say machine tools. I said machinery. Batteries, gasoline engines, simple stuff like that. Well, I didn't start at Central Tool as president or board chairman. I started in the shop working with my hands. Sure, I know about machinery." "That's fine. You can help Malachi and Admiral Hazard. We've taken the batteries out of my car and the Admiral's car and hooked them on to the Admiral's shortwave set so we can find out what cooks around the world. Only, it doesn't work right. Something's wrong with the circuit, and the batteries are fading, and I don't know how we're going to charge them." "Oh, very simple," Bill said. "Power takeoff from the Model A. It'll work so long as you have gas." "Fine," Randy said. "That's your first job, Bill, helping Malachi." "Malachi? Isn't he the brother of our cleaning woman, Missouri, your yardman?" "That's him, and he's a first-class mechanic." Bill McGovern smiled. "So I'll be a mechanic, second class." "That's right." Bill rose. "All right, it's a deal. I'll dress and then—" He stopped. "Oh, Lord, I forgot. Poor Lavinia. Randy, what am I going to do about her?" He hesitated as if the word were crude, but he could find no other. "Her body." "We're attending to that," Randy said. "Dan Gunn has gone up to get Bubba Offenhouse, and I hope Bubba will handle the burial. Meanwhile, I think that you and Lib better start packing. We'll have to make 3 or 4 trips, I guess. How much gas have you got in your car?" Lib said, "A couple of gallons, I think." That'll be enough to make the move, and you won't need the car after that, and we can use the battery for Sam Hazard's shortwave set. While they packed, Randy prowled the house searching for useful items. In a kitchen cupboard, he discovered an old pitted iron pot of tremendous capacity, and forgetting the presence of death in the house, whooped with delight. Lib raced into the kitchen, demanding a reason for the shouting, and he hefted the pot. "I bet it'll hold 2 gallons. Oh my God, what a find!" "It's just an old pot that Mother bought when we were in New England one summer. An antique, and she thought it would look wonderful with a plant, and it looked awful." "It'll look beautiful hanging in the dining room fireplace," Randy said, "filled with stew." The old pot was the most useful object. Indeed, it was one of the few useful objects he found in the McGovern house. 20 minutes later, Dan Gunn returned alone and without Bubba Offenhouse. He said, Bubba, can't help us and would like to bury himself. He's got dysentery, running at both ends. He and Kitty were certain it was radiation poisoning. Symptoms are pretty much alike, you know. Both of them were in panic. He'll get over it in a few days, but that's not helping us now." Randy said, "So what do we do?" Dan looked at Bill McGovern, fully dressed now, but still unwashed and unshaven, for there was no water in the house except a jug for drinking that Randy had brought to them the day before. Dan said, "I think that's up to Bill to decide." "What is there to decide?" Bill asked. "Whether to bury your wife here or in the cemetery. You don't have a plot at Repose in Peace, but I'm sure Bubba wouldn't mind. Anyway, there's nothing he can do about it, and you can settle with him later." Bill McGovern turned to his daughter. "What do you say, Elizabeth?" "Well, of course, I think Mother deserves a proper funeral in a cemetery. It seems like the least we can do for her, and yet—" She turned to Randy. "You don't agree, do you, Randy?" Randy was glad that she had asked. Intervening in this private and personal matter was brutal but necessary. "No, I don't agree. It is 6 miles to the cemetery, and we'd have to make the trip in 2 cars because of Lavinia. That's 24 miles worth of gasoline, round trip, and we can't afford that. We will have to bury Lavinia here on the grounds." "But how?" Lib began. "Where do you keep the shovels, Bill?" "There's a tool shed back of the garage." While handing a shovel to Dan and selecting one for himself, Randy examined the other tools. There was a new axe. It would be very useful. There were pitchforks, edgers, a scythe, a wheelbarrow. He would bring Malachi over before dark, and they would divvy up the McGovern tools. In everything he did now, he found that he looked into the needs of the future. Between house and river, a crescent-shaped azalea bed flanked the west border of the McGovern property. The bitter blue grass had been carefully tended, and the bed was shaded from the afternoon's hot sun by a live oak, older than Fort Repose. Looking around, Randy could find no spot more suitable for a grave. He stepped off 6 feet and marked a rectangle within the crescent, and he and Dan began to dig. After a few minutes, Randy removed his sweater. This was no easy job. Dan stopped and inspected his plans. He said, "I'm getting ditch digger's hands. Very bad for a surgeon." And they continued to dig, steadily, until it was awkward working from the surface, and Randy stepped into the deepening grave. They had made a discovery. A grave designed to accommodate one person must be dug by one person alone. When Randy paused, winded, Bill McGovern stepped down and took the shovel, saying, "I'll spell you." From above, Lib watched. Presently she said, "That's enough for you, Dad. Remember, the blood pressure. I don't want to lose you, too." And she stepped into the hole and relieved him of the shovel. After he climbed out, panting and white-faced, she thrust the shovel savagely into the sand, and as she dug, her stature increased in Randy's eyes. She was like a fine sword, slender and flexible, but steel, a woman of courage. It was not gentlemanly, but Randy allowed her to dig, recognizing that physical effort was an outlet for her emotions. When her pace slowed, he dropped into the hole and took the shovel. "That's enough. Dan and I will finish. You and your father had better go back to the house and get on with your packing." "You don't want us to help you carry her out, do you?" "I think it would be better if you didn't." Dan reached down and lifted her out of the hole. When the grave was finished, they wrapped Lavinia's emaciated body in her bedsheets. Her coffin was an electric blanket and her hearse a wheelbarrow. They lowered her into the 5-foot hole and packed in the sand and loam afterwards, leaving an insignificant mound. Randy knew that when spring came, the mound would flatten with the rains, and the grass would swiftly cover it, and by June it would have disappeared entirely. Randy called the McGoverns. There was no service, no spoken word. They all stood silent for a moment, and then Bill said, "We don't even have a wooden marker for her, or a sliver of stone, do we?" "It isn't necessary." "Oh, sorry. We could take something out of the house," Randy suggested. "A statue, a vase, or something." "It isn't necessary," Lib said. "The house is my mother's monument." This, of course, was true. And they turned from the grave and back to their work. That evening, Bill McGovern, with some eagerness, walked to the Henrys' house and talked to Malachi, and together they went along the riverbank to Sam Hazard's house and conferred with him for a plan for supplying power for the Admiral's shortwave receiver. Dan Gunn drove to Fort Repose to visit the homeless, some of them sick or burned, lodged in the school. Randy and Lib McGovern sat alone on the front porch steps, Lib's elbows on her knees, her chin supported by her hands, Randy's arms encircling her shoulders, and she was speaking of her mother. I'm sure she never really comprehended what had happened on the day, or ever could, and perhaps I'm only rationalizing, but I think that her death was an act of mercy. Randy heard someone running up the driveway, and then he saw the figure and recognized Ben Franklin. "Ben!" he called. "What's the matter?" Ben stopped, out of breath, and said, "Something's happening at Miss Weechek's." Randy rose, ready to get his pistol. "What happened?" "I don't know. I was just walking by her house, and I heard somebody scream, I think Miss Weechek, and then I heard her crying." Randy said, "We'd better take a look, Lib. You stay here, Ben." Yellow candlelight shone from Florence's kitchen. They went to the back door. Florence was wailing, and Randy entered without bothering to knock. As he opened the screen door, green and yellow feathers fluttered around his feet. Florence's head rested on her arms on the kitchen table, and she was dressed in a quilted, rose-hued robe. Alice Cooksey was with her, coaxing water to boil on a sterno kit. Randy said, "What seems to be the trouble?" Sterno is the same thing as canned heat, by the way. Florence raised her head. Her untidy pink hair was moist and stringy, and her eyes were swollen. "Sir Percy ate Anthony," she said, and she began to sob. "She's had a terrible day," said Alice Cooksey. "I'm trying to make tea. She'll be better after she's had some tea." "What all happened?" Randy asked. "Well, it really began yesterday," Alice said. "When we woke up yesterday morning, the angel fish were dead. You know how cold it was night before last, and of course, without electricity, there's no heat for the aquarium. And this morning, all the mollies and neons were dead. As a matter of fact, nothing's alive in the tank except the miniature catfish and a few guppies. And then this evening..." "Sir Percy," Florence interrupted. "A murderer!" "Hush, dear," Alice said. "The water will be boiling in a moment." She turned to Randy. "Florence really shouldn't blame Sir Percy. After all, there's been no milk for him and very little of anything else. As a matter of fact, we haven't seen Sir Percy in 3 or 4 days, and I suppose he was out hunting for himself. But a few minutes ago, when Anthony flew home, Sir Percy was on the porch. Ambushed poor Anthony, Florence said. Actually ambushed him, killed him, and ate him right there on the porch. Poor Cleo. Where's Sir Percy now? Randy asked. He's gone again, Alice said. He'd better not come back. Randy was thoughtful. Hunting cats would be a problem. And what would happen to dogs? He still had a few cans of dog food for Graff, but he could foresee a time when humans might look upon dog food as a delicacy. He said aloud, but speaking to himself rather than the others, "Survival of the fittest." "What do you mean?" Lib said. "This is very important. The strong survive, the frail die. The exotic fish die because the aquarium isn't heated. The common guppy lives. So does the tough catfish. The house cat turns hunter and eats the pet bird. If it didn't, he'd starve. That's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be." Florence had stopped crying. "You mean with humans? You mean we humans are going to have to turn savage like Sir Percy? Well, I can't do it. I don't want to live in that kind of a world, Randy." "You'll live, Florence," Randy said. Walking back to his own house, Randy said, "Florence is a guppy. A nice, drab little guppy. And that's why she'll survive." "What about you and me?" Lib said. "We're going to have to be tough. We're going to have to be like catfish."